The afternoon sun beat down on the busy town square as people hurried about their day. Among them was a 73-year-old man with weathered hands and a slight limp to his walk. His name was Tom, and he wore a simple blue cap, faded jeans, and a plain button-up shirt that had seen better days. Nothing about his appearance suggested he was anything other than an ordinary senior citizen enjoying the warmth of the day. Tom made his way toward a bench near the fountain, planning to rest his legs before continuing his errands. He'd been having trouble with his knee lately, an old injury that never quite healed right. As he sat down, he pulled out a small paper bag containing a sandwich he'd made at home. Living on a fixed income meant saving money wherever possible, and bringing lunch from home was one of his habits. Nearby, a group of 5 young men in their early 20s loitered by the edge of the square. They wore matching leather jackets despite the heat, their faces set in permanent scowls as they surveyed the area. These weren't ordinary troublemakers, they were known around town as the Riverside Boys, a gang that had been causing increasing problems in the community over the past year. The leader, a tall guy with a shaved head and multiple tattoos covering his arms, noticed Tom sitting alone. With a nod to his friends, he started walking toward the old man, the others following close behind. "Hey, old-timer," the leader called out, his voice carrying across the square and causing several passers-by to quicken their pace and look away. "That's our bench you're sitting on." Tom looked up from his sandwich, confusion crossing his face. "Pardon me?" "You heard me," the leader said as the group surrounded Tom. "We sit here every day. Everyone knows that." The other gang members laughed, forming a tight circle around the bench. Tom glanced around, noticing how the square had suddenly emptied of people willing to intervene. A young mother hurried her children away, while a businessman pretended to be deeply engaged with his phone. No one wanted trouble with the Riverside Boys. "I didn't know this bench belonged to anyone," Tom said calmly. "The park is public property." The leader's face darkened. "You got a smart mouth for an old man." He reached down and knocked the sandwich from Tom's hand, sending it to the ground. "Maybe you need to learn some respect." Another gang member kicked at Tom's cane that was leaning against the bench, sending it clattering across the pavement. "What are you gonna do now, Grandpa? Chase after it?" They howled with laughter. Tom didn't move. He didn't reach for the cane or look at his ruined lunch. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the leader with an intensity that made the young man shift uncomfortably. "You know," Tom said, his voice steady and quiet, "in Vietnam, we had a saying, never corner something that's more dangerous than you." The laughter died down as the gang members exchanged glances. "What did you say?" the leader asked, leaning in closer. "I served with the 173rd Airborne Brigade in the Ia Drang Valley," Tom continued, still not raising his voice. "That was 1965. Fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the war. After that, I spent 3 years with Special Operations." There was something in the way he spoke, no bravado, no tremor of fear, just simple facts stated with absolute certainty, that made the air around them seem suddenly charged with tension. "You expect us to believe that?" one of the gang members said, but his voice had lost its edge. Tom slowly rolled up his left sleeve to reveal a faded tattoo of an eagle with the words, "Death from Above," and beneath it the dates, 1965 to 1971. "I've seen and done things that would keep you boys awake at night," Tom said. "Not things I'm proud of, necessarily, but things I had to do to keep my brothers alive." He looked around at each of them. "I came home with 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and nightmares that still wake me up 50 years later." The square had gone quiet. Even those who had been pretending not to notice were now watching the confrontation. "Now," Tom continued, "I'm just an old man who wants to eat his lunch in peace. I'm not looking for trouble. Never have been. But make no mistake," he looked directly at the leader, "I'm not afraid of it either." There was something in Tom's eyes, a cold, steady gaze that had seen the worst humanity had to offer and survived it, that made the leader take an involuntary step back. "Whatever, old man," the leader said, trying to sound dismissive but failing to hide the uncertainty in his voice. "Keep your stupid bench." Another gang member, trying to save face, kicked Tom's sandwich further away. "Enjoy your lunch," he sneered, but the bravado sounded hollow. As the gang began to back away, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Everyone turned to see a middle-aged woman striding across the square, phone in hand. "I've called the police," she announced loudly. "And I've been recording everything for the last 5 minutes." She wasn't alone. Behind her, several other people from the square had rallied together, a construction worker still in his hard hat, an elderly couple who had been feeding pigeons, and the businessman who had earlier been avoiding eye contact. "We all saw what happened," the woman continued, coming to stand beside Tom. "And we're all willing to make statements." The leader of the gang looked around, suddenly aware that they were outnumbered by angry citizens. What had started as simple fun picking on an old man had turned into something much more complicated. "This ain't over," he muttered, but the threat sounded empty even to his own ears. With a jerk of his head, he signaled to his friends, and they quickly retreated across the square. As they disappeared down a side street, the woman turned to Tom. "Are you all right, sir? I'm so sorry it took us so long to step in. Those boys have been terrorizing everyone for months." Tom nodded, the intensity in his eyes softening. "I'm fine, thank you." He looked around at the small crowd that had gathered. "I appreciate you all coming over." The construction worker picked up Tom's cane and handed it back to him with respect in his eyes. "Sir, what you did took guts. Those guys don't back down for anyone." Tom accepted the cane with a nod. "Sometimes standing your ground is all you can do." He glanced at his sandwich lying in the dirt and sighed. "Please, let me buy you lunch," offered the businessman, who now looked ashamed for having initially ignored the situation. "It's the least I can do." "That's kind of you, but not necessary," Tom replied, slowly standing up. "I've got more food at home." The woman who had confronted the gang introduced herself as Helen, a local school teacher. "Those boys have been causing trouble at the high school too. Nobody seems able to do anything about them." As the small crowd dispersed, Helen stayed behind with Tom. "Would you mind if I walked with you? Just to make sure those boys don't come back." Tom smiled. "I'd appreciate the company." As they walked through the park, Helen asked, "Was it true? What you told them about Vietnam?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "Every word," he finally said. "Though it's not something I usually talk about." "My father served in Vietnam," Helen said. "He never talked about it either." They reached a modest apartment building a few blocks from the park. Tom invited Helen in for coffee, and she accepted, curious about this quiet man who had shown such courage. Tom's apartment was small but tidy, with simple furnishings. What caught Helen's eye were the photographs on the wall, young men in military uniforms, their faces serious but with hints of smiles around their eyes. Among them was a younger version of Tom, standing tall beside his fellow soldiers. While Tom prepared coffee in the kitchen, Helen noticed a display case on the bookshelf. Inside were the medals Tom had mentioned, 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star, along with a folded American flag in a triangle display case. "Those were good men," Tom said, noticing her looking at the photos. "I was lucky to serve with them." As they sat drinking coffee, Tom shared bits and pieces of his life after the war. He'd worked as a mechanic until retirement, never married, and lived quietly. The neighborhood had changed over the years, and not always for the better. "Those boys in the park," Tom said thoughtfully, "they're looking for something. Power, respect, belonging. Same things we all want. They're just going about it all wrong." Helen nodded. "The leader, he's a former student of mine. Tough home life. Father in prison, mother working 2 jobs. Not that it excuses his behavior. No, it doesn't, Tom agreed. But it explains some things. Later that evening, after Helen had left, Tom sat in his recliner thinking about the day's events. It had been years since he'd talked about Vietnam with anyone. Years since he'd stood up to anyone like he had today. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Helen. "Tom, I hate to bother you, but there's something you should know," she said, her voice tense. "I just got a call from a colleague. Those boys have been asking around about you. They know where you live." Tom's expression didn't change. He thanked Helen for the warning and hung up. Then he walked to his closet and pulled out an old footlocker he hadn't opened in decades. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a set of dog tags. He held them in his weathered hands, memories flooding back. Then he looked out the window at the darkening street. This wasn't Vietnam, and he wasn't that soldier anymore. But some instincts never fade. Tom didn't sleep much that night. Old habits returned easily, checking windows, securing doors, keeping lights off to maintain night vision. He wasn't afraid, just prepared. When his phone rang early the next morning, he answered on the first ring. "Tom, it's Helen. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he assured her. Nothing happened. "Listen," Helen said, "I've been thinking. The community center is having a meeting tonight about neighborhood safety. After what happened yesterday, would you consider coming? People need to hear what these boys are doing." Tom hesitated. He'd spent decades keeping to himself, avoiding attention. "I don't want to make things worse," he said finally. "You won't," Helen insisted. "The police will be there too. It's time someone stood up to these bullies, and you've already shown more courage than the rest of us combined." After some persuasion, Tom agreed. That evening, Helen picked him up and drove to the community center. The meeting room was packed with concerned residents, parents, business owners, elderly couples, teenagers. Tom recognized several faces from the park yesterday. The police officer leading the discussion was explaining the challenges they faced. "Unless we catch them in the act or have witnesses willing to testify." "Like me?" Tom's voice, though quiet, carried across the room. All heads turned toward him. For the next few minutes, Tom described what had happened in the park. Others began sharing their stories too: a shop owner who paid protection money, a teenager who took the long way to school to avoid them, an elderly woman who no longer felt safe walking to church. The police officer looked troubled. "We need people willing to file official reports. Without that, our hands are tied." "I'll file a report," Tom said. One by one, others raised their hands too. As the meeting ended, a tall man in his 50s approached Tom. His uniform identified him as Chief Rodriguez of the local police. "Mr. Hayes," he said, extending his hand. "I've heard about what happened yesterday. Brave thing you did." Tom shook his hand. "Just did what needed doing." The chief lowered his voice. "Those boys have been escalating. Started with vandalism, moved to intimidation, now they're getting bolder. I'm worried someone's going to get hurt." "You think they'll come after me," Tom stated. It wasn't a question. "I think you challenged them publicly, and they won't let that stand. We'll increase patrols in your area, but..." The chief hesitated. "Be careful, sir." On the drive home, Helen noticed Tom was unusually quiet. "Regrets?" she asked. Tom shook his head. "Just thinking. Those boys aren't the enemy. They're lost." "They're dangerous, Tom," Helen reminded him. "So was I, once upon a time." He stared out the window at the passing streetlights. "When I came back from Vietnam, I was angry. Felt like the world owed me something." "What changed?" Met an old sergeant who'd served in Korea. He set me straight. Showed me another path. Tom turned to Helen. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person who cares enough to show you a different way. When they arrived at Tom's apartment, Helen hesitated before driving away. Will you be okay? You could stay with me and my husband if you're worried. Tom smiled. I'll be fine. Been taking care of myself a long time. But as he climbed the stairs to his apartment, Tom noticed a car parked across the street. Even in the darkness, he recognized the silhouettes inside. The Riverside Boys were watching his home. Instead of going inside, Tom sat on the front steps of his building. He pulled out his dog tags and held them in his hand, waiting. Whatever happened next, he would face it head-on. The car across the street remained still for nearly an hour. Tom didn't move either. Patience was something he'd learned in the jungle, how to wait, hidden and silent, for hours or even days. This was nothing compared to that. Finally, the car doors opened. 4 of the 5 Riverside Boys stepped out, including their leader. They approached slowly, trying to look casual but failing to hide their nervousness. Tom noticed they kept their hands in their pockets, a bad sign. "Evening, gentlemen," Tom called out, his voice steady and clear in the night air. "Bit late for a social call, isn't it?" The leader stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at Tom. "You made us look bad, old man." "You did that yourselves," Tom replied. "Nobody stands up to us," the leader continued. "Nobody. Now everyone's talking about it. Filing police reports." Tom studied the young man's face, the anger there, but also confusion and something else. Pride, maybe. Wounded pride. "What's your name, son?" Tom asked. The question seemed to catch the leader off guard. "Why do you care?" "Because I'd like to know who I'm talking to." The leader hesitated, then said, "They call me Razor." Tom nodded, holding back any comment on the nickname. "Well, Razor, seems to me you boys have a choice to make. The police are watching you now. Community's standing up. Your little reign of terror is coming to an end one way or another." One of the other gang members stepped forward. "You threatening us, old man?" "Not at all," Tom said calmly. "I'm offering you a way out." That caught them by surprise. Tom continued, "I know the construction foreman at the new development on Oak Street. He needs workers. Pays decent, works honest. Could put in a word." The boys exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this turn in the conversation. "We don't need your charity," Razor spat, but there was less conviction in his voice. "Not charity. Opportunity." Tom stood up slowly, using his cane for support. "When I came back from Vietnam, I was angry at the world. Thought everyone owed me something. Made some bad choices until someone gave me a chance to make better ones. This is different," Razor insisted. "Is it?" Tom asked. "You boys think you're tough? Try watching your friends die in a jungle halfway around the world. Try living with those memories for 50 years. His voice remained even, not accusatory or preachy, just matter of fact. For a moment, no one spoke. A police car rolled slowly down the street, its spotlight sweeping across the group. The officer inside gave them a long look before continuing on patrol. "Think about it," Tom said. "My offer stands until the end of the week. After that." He shrugged. "Your choice." Razor stared at Tom for a long moment, conflict evident in his eyes. Without another word, he turned and walked back to the car, his friends following. As they drove away, Tom watched until their taillights disappeared around the corner. He didn't know if they'd take his offer. But he'd given them something to think about, and sometimes that was enough to change a person's path. 2 days passed without any sign of the Riverside Boys. Tom went about his routine, morning coffee at the diner, errands in town, evening news on his old television. But he remained alert, watching shadows, noting unfamiliar cars. Helen called daily to check on him. The community had rallied, with neighbors driving by his apartment more frequently and the police maintaining their increased patrols. Tom appreciated their concern but didn't want to be treated like someone who needed protection. On the third morning, as Tom walked to the diner for breakfast, he spotted a familiar figure leaning against a lamppost half a block ahead. It was Razor, alone this time, watching Tom approach. Tom didn't change his pace or direction. He continued forward, his cane tapping rhythmically on the sidewalk. "Morning," Tom said when he reached the young man. Razor didn't return the greeting. His eyes were bloodshot, his posture tense. "Been thinking about what you said." Tom nodded but remained silent, giving the young man space to continue. "Why would you help us? After what we did?" Razor's voice held genuine confusion. "Everyone deserves a second chance," Tom replied simply. "I got mine." Razor kicked at the ground, hands stuffed deep in his pockets. "The guys think I'm weak for even talking to you." "Takes more strength to change than to stay the same," Tom observed. They stood in silence for a moment, an unlikely pair on the morning sidewalk, an aging veteran and a troubled young man at a crossroads. "That job," Razor finally said. "It's still available?" "It is." Tom tried to keep the surprise from his voice. "Maybe I'll check it out." "Just me though." "Can't speak for the others." Tom nodded. "That's a start. Meet me here tomorrow at 7 a.m. I'll take you there myself." As Razor walked away, Tom continued to the diner, his mind on the young man's request. He wondered if it was genuine or some kind of trap. The old soldier in him remained cautious, but the part that remembered his own second chance hoped for the best. At the diner, Helen was waiting in their usual booth. Since the incident in the park, they'd made a habit of having breakfast together. "You look thoughtful," she remarked as he sat down. Tom told her about his encounter with Razor. "Do you think he's serious?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "Hard to say. But if there's even a chance." "You're taking a risk, Tom." He shrugged. "Life's full of risks. Some are worth taking." Later that day, Tom called his friend at the construction site to arrange the job opportunity. Then he called Chief Rodriguez to inform him of the plan. The chief wasn't thrilled but agreed to have plainclothes officers nearby, just in case. That night, Tom sat by his window, looking out at the street below. He thought about Razor and the choice the young man was facing. It reminded him of his own crossroads moment all those years ago. Some turns in life defined everything that came after. Tomorrow would tell which path Razor would choose. Tom arrived at the meeting spot 15 minutes early, dressed in his usual simple clothes with a thermos of coffee in hand. The morning was cool, the street quiet except for the occasional passing car heading to early shifts. At 6:58, Tom spotted Razor approaching from the opposite direction. The young man was alone, wearing jeans and a plain black t-shirt instead of his usual gang attire. His swagger was gone, replaced by what looked like nervous energy. "Didn't think you'd actually show," Razor said as he reached Tom. "I could say the same about you." Tom offered a small smile. "Coffee?" Razor hesitated before accepting the thermos cup Tom poured. "The guys found out I was coming. They weren't happy about it." Tom noted a fresh bruise forming near Razor's eye but didn't comment on it. "You still came?" "Yeah, well." Razor shrugged, taking a sip of coffee. "Not like I got better options." They walked to Tom's old pickup truck parked nearby. As they drove to the construction site, Tom pointed out landmarks from the neighborhood's better days: the movie theater now closed, the park where families once gathered for summer concerts, the high school football field where the town celebrated championships. A week passed. Tom hadn't heard from Razor but had checked with Dave, who confirmed the young man had shown up every day, on time and working hard. It wasn't like Tom to worry about someone else's problems, not after decades of keeping to himself, but he found himself invested in Razor's success. One evening, Tom was returning from the grocery store when he noticed 3 of the Riverside boys waiting near his apartment building. The same ones who had been with Razor that day in the park, but not Razor himself. Tom considered his options, then decided to face them directly. He approached steadily, groceries in one hand, cane in the other. "Looking for someone?" he asked calmly. The tallest of the 3 stepped forward. "Where's Razor?" "He ain't been home in days." "He's working," Tom replied. "Making an honest living." "Working?" The tall one laughed, but it sounded forced. "Razor don't work. He's one of us." "People change," Tom said simply. The second gang member, a stocky guy with a patchy beard, moved closer. "You turned him against us, old man. He made his own choice." The third boy, younger than the others, looked nervous. "Is he really working at that construction site?" Tom nodded. "Doing well, from what I hear." The 3 exchanged glances, something unspoken passing between them. The tall one took another step toward Tom, his hand moving to his pocket. "Maybe we don't like people messing with our crew." Before the situation could escalate, a police car turned onto the street, cruising slowly their way. The boys noticed it too. "This ain't over," the tall one muttered, backing away. The 3 retreated quickly, disappearing around the corner. Tom continued to his apartment, set down his groceries, and called Chief Rodriguez to report the encounter. As he hung up, there was a knock at his door. Looking through the peephole, Tom was surprised to see Razor standing there, still in his work clothes, dust covering his boots. "Hope it's okay I stopped by," Razor said when Tom opened the door. "Dave gave me today's pay in cash." He held up an envelope. "Thought maybe I could give you some for letting me use your address." "Keep it," Tom said. "You're going to need it." Razor hesitated, then nodded. "Your friends were just here," Tom told him. "They seemed concerned about your whereabouts." Something like worry crossed Razor's face. "They came here? What did they say?" "They miss their leader," Tom said carefully. "Not sure they understand your new direction." Razor looked down at his dusty work boots. "Been staying at a shelter downtown. Trying to save up for a room somewhere." "Smart move," Tom said. He considered the young man standing before him, tired from honest work, trying to start over. "I've got a spare room," he heard himself say. "It's not much, but it's yours if you need it. Temporary, until you get on your feet." Razor's head snapped up in surprise. "You'd let me stay here? After everything?" "Sometimes moving forward means leaving the past where it belongs," Tom said. "I learned that the hard way." For the first time since they'd met, Razor smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll keep showing up for work," Tom replied. "That's all the thanks I need." Over the next 2 weeks, a routine developed. Tom and Razor would leave together in the morning, Tom to his usual activities, Razor to the construction site. In the evenings, they'd share simple meals and watch old westerns on TV, talking little but growing comfortable in each other's company. Tom noticed changes in the young man. The hardened edge in his eyes was softening. His posture was more relaxed, less ready for confrontation. He was sleeping better too, no longer startling at every sound in the night. Word spread through the neighborhood about Tom taking in one of the Riverside boys. Some neighbors were concerned, but Helen defended Tom's decision to anyone who questioned it. "If Tom Hayes believes in giving the boy a chance, that's good enough for me," she told the skeptics. One Saturday morning, Tom was teaching Razor how to fix the leaky faucet in the bathroom when Chief Rodriguez called. "Thought you should know," the chief said, "we arrested 2 of the Riverside boys last night. Caught them vandalizing the community center. They had spray paint, writing threats against you and your house guest." Tom thanked him for the information and hung up, not mentioning it to Razor. No sense adding to the young man's worries. That afternoon, as they walked to the grocery store, Tom noticed Razor growing tense, his eyes scanning constantly. "Something on your mind?" Tom asked. Razor hesitated. "Been feeling watched lately. Like eyes on my back." They continued in silence until Razor suddenly stopped. "There," he said quietly, nodding toward a car parked across the street. Tom followed his gaze. Inside sat the remaining members of the Riverside boys, watching them intently. "Keep walking," Tom said calmly. "Don't engage." But as they passed the next block, the car pulled alongside them, windows rolling down. "Traitor," shouted one of the boys from inside. "You forget who your real friends are." Razor stopped walking. "Go home, guys. I'm done with that life." The driver, the tall boy who'd confronted Tom earlier, stepped out of the car. "Done with us, you mean? After everything we've been through?" "It's not too late for you guys too," Razor said. "There's honest work out there." Laughter erupted from the car. "Listen to him. 2 weeks with the old man and he thinks he's better than us." The tall boy moved closer, lowering his voice. "We're planning something big tonight. Last chance to come back. Prove you're still one of us." Tom watched the exchange silently, seeing the conflict in Razor's face. "I can't," Razor said finally. "That path only leads one place. Prison or the cemetery." The tall boy's expression hardened. "You made your choice." He turned to Tom. "This is on you, old man. You'll regret turning him against us." As they drove away, tires squealing, Razor looked shaken. "You did good," Tom told him. "They're planning something tonight," Razor said. "Something big." Tom nodded. "Then we better talk to Chief Rodriguez." As they changed direction toward the police station, Tom noticed a new determination in Razor's stride. The young man was no longer looking back, he was moving forward, even if it meant turning against his past. 3 months later, the community center was packed for its annual neighborhood appreciation dinner. At a table near the front sat Tom and Razor, alongside Helen, Chief Rodriguez, and Dave the construction foreman. Razor was nearly unrecognizable from the angry young man who had confronted Tom in the park. His hair was neatly trimmed, his posture confident but relaxed. He'd recently been promoted to assistant foreman at the construction site, with Dave mentioning plans for training him in specialized skills. The night the Riverside boys had planned their something big, an attempted robbery at the local pharmacy, had ended with all of them in custody, thanks to Razor's warning. 2 had accepted plea deals that included rehabilitation programs. The others faced longer sentences due to prior records. "Ladies and gentlemen," the community center director called for attention. "Tonight, we recognize individuals who've made our neighborhood safer and stronger. Our first honoree is someone who stood up when others wouldn't." Tom shifted uncomfortably as his name was called. He'd never sought recognition for anything he'd done, in Vietnam or since. "Mr. Hayes not only confronted the gang that had been terrorizing our community," the director continued, "but he showed us something even more important, that everyone deserves a second chance." Applause filled the room as Tom reluctantly made his way to the podium. He leaned on his cane, looking out at the faces watching him, neighbors who had once avoided eye contact, now smiling warmly. "I'm not one for speeches," Tom began. "In Vietnam, I learned that bravery isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right despite being afraid." He paused, looking at Razor. "Sometimes the bravest thing isn't standing up to others. It's standing up to yourself, admitting when you're on the wrong path. Tom gestured toward Razor. If you want to honor someone tonight, honor this young man. He had the courage to change when change seemed impossible. The room erupted in more applause as Razor looked down, embarrassed but proud. Later that evening, as they walked home, Razor said, "You know, I've been thinking about what you told me about that sergeant who helped you after Vietnam." Tom nodded, remembering. "I want to do that for someone else someday," Razor continued. "Pay it forward, you know." Tom smiled. "You will." As they approached Tom's apartment, their apartment now, at least until Razor saved enough for his own place, Tom felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced since before Vietnam. The nightmares that had plagued him for decades had grown less frequent. The memories were still there, but somehow less painful. "Got something for you," Tom said when they were inside. He handed Razor an envelope. Inside was a brochure for the community college's GED program, along with an application already filled out. "Education opens doors," Tom said simply. Razor studied the papers, then looked up with determined eyes. "I'll start next semester." Tom nodded, satisfied. The angry young man who had confronted him in the park months ago was gone. In his place stood someone with a future. Sometimes the battles that matter most aren't fought with weapons, Tom thought. They're fought with patience, understanding, and the belief that people can change. That was a victory worth fighting for.